Hello and welcome to another episode of KARE 11 on the Record. I'm political reporter Danny Spiewak. We're just months away from Minnesota Republicans picking their next candidate for the governor's race in 2026. We've been sitting down with several candidates in recent weeks, and this week we talked with State Representative Kristen Robbins. Well, Representative, thank you for joining us here today at KARE 11. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with, of course, the precinct caucuses were this week, and you were fifth in the informal straw poll. What do you see as your path forward in this campaign in the Republican side for the GOP nomination?
Yeah, I've said from the beginning when I got in August that I'm going to stay in the race as long as I think I'm the best candidate to win the general election. We have often endorsed people who haven't won a general election, which is why it's been 20 years since Tim Pawlenty's reelect. And so we have to think about who's the best candidate who can go the distance to win the governor's race, not just get the endorsement. And I represent a purple district. So in my district, President Trump won by 0.4% and I won by 14 points. So those are the kinds of numbers we need if we're going to put together a winning statewide coalition.
President Trump, of course, has lost Minnesota 3 times. His approval ratings have declined since he took office in his second term. Would you seek an endorsement from him in this process as you're running for the seat?
I would certainly welcome the endorsement of the president. I don't know that he's getting involved in these kind of races, at least not this early, but anyone would want the president's endorsement.
Have you been supportive of his policies in general in his second term?
Generally, I'd say he's doing a really good job on getting the border closed. I mean, we were told it couldn't be done, and he did it relatively quickly. And I think a lot of what he's done to make trade more fair for our industries, especially returning manufacturing, has been really helpful. I think there's been many good things. The help that we're getting from the federal government to stop the fraud. I called for a full audit from the Federal Department of Human Services last July. And now we're finally getting that, as well as a lot of other resources from Treasury and the Small Business Administration. So on the fraud front, he's been terrific.
I'll certainly have a lot to ask you on the fraud side, since you're, of course, the head of the fraud committee in the House in Minnesota. When it comes to the crisis, though, that's ongoing with ICE and federal agents in Minnesota, do you believe that the Trump administration has acted in the right as they've come to Minnesota with this immigration enforcement?
I think it's been heartbreaking that 2 Minnesotans were killed, and truly we're grieving for their families, and I'm very sad about it. And what I've called from the very beginning, is that our federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies need to work together so that we do get the criminals off our streets. Federal immigration law is important and must be enforced. And even under President Obama, they had an ICE office in Hennepin County Jail so that we could honor these detainers and get the criminals off the streets so they didn't have to go hunt them down in the neighborhoods. And that's been the problem. I think the Walz administration and Mayor Frey wanted the chaos of the optics of ICE not being able to do their job and just get people off the streets from the jails, which is what they supported during the Obama administration. And so because ICE, in order to enforce the law, has to go into the neighborhoods, it's led to all this chaos, all these protests, and terribly the loss of life. So I'm heartened that they seem to be cooperating now. I think it really has mattered to tone it down, and that we're seeing a drawdown of some of the Border Patrol agents. So I'm very hopeful. But what we need from our leaders is cooperation across all levels of government so that we can end this chaos.
You've had some Republican members in the legislature who have expressed concerns about the conduct of the federal agents. There have been local law enforcement have alleged racial profiling. Is there any blame here that you place on the Trump administration for the events that have occurred?
So I would say if there has been misconduct by any Border Patrol or ICE official, it's on them, and they should be dealt with, and I believe they are being dealt with. I think Tom Homan was very clear that if people are inappropriately detaining people or profiling people or doing other things outside the bounds of their mission, that they will be dealt with in their process, which is the right thing to do. We need our law enforcement agents to fulfill their mission and abide by the law, and we need the public to do that. And when the public it leads from constitutionally protected protesting, which I fully support, to obstructing, interfering, assaulting, or vandalizing. They also need to be dealt with. So it's both sides. And I'm optimistic that we are to a point where both are starting to cooperate more.
When it comes to the issue of fraud, which of course is intertwined with the Trump administration's reasoning for surging agents here in the first place, if you were governor, what would be some specific proposals and steps you would take to solve the fraud problem in Minnesota?
First of all, we'd have all new commissioners, all new deputy commissioners, assistant commissioners, and we would have a no fraud, no excuses culture. This has been allowed to happen because the Walz administration has turned a blind eye in the face of OLA reports, credible whistleblower reports that we've had for years. So we have got to say we are holding people accountable, and they will, if they're allowing this to happen on their watch, if they're not administering these programs correctly, they're gone. And if there is ability to prosecute under the malfeasance statute, we should do that, because we have to have a government that citizens have faith in. We have lost the trust of the citizens in how Minnesota government is run, which is terrible. But secondly, we would need to change a lot of the guardrails. So rather than rely on attestation, we would rely on documentation for eligibility for providers and for recipients. We would clean up the recipient roles, renew eligibility. We would have. Right now, they've always had the ability to stop payment for credible allegations of fraud or do prepayment reviews, but they weren't doing it. So we could standardize that and many other internal controls across state government, and that's how we're going to clean it up. But we need to get the public to have faith that we are doing our jobs.
Would you keep the fraud czar on staff that Governor Walz appointed a couple of months ago?
No, we need the independent Office of Inspector General that passed the Democrat-led Senate 60-7. Having a governor-appointed official, it's like the fox guarding the hen house. No, I would absolutely have an independent executive branch Inspector General.
Now, on your fraud committee in the Minnesota House, we've covered a lot of the hearings. Democrats on the committee have often criticized it, believing it's a political stunt. They've said that they don't believe that real legislation has been coming out of it. Do you believe that it's been effective as a vehicle for fighting fraud?
Absolutely. I think what we have seen is we've uncovered and exposed all these vectors of fraud, and we have passed legislation like the new whistleblower law, other ways to tighten internal controls. And we've kept the pressure on the agency officials to come in and explain what they're doing and why they're not doing their jobs. And so that pressure, I think, is what's led to all these federal investigations, and it's also led to the governor not running again. Like, we've had incredible success. Because of our pressure, we had the day before my adult daycare services hearing in December, they announced they were pausing new providers in adult day services. The day before my hearing on housing stabilization, they fired someone who had been running the housing stabilization program. So because we are keeping the pressure on, it's forcing the government to take action in the Walz administration that they wouldn't have otherwise taken, because they didn't take it for 7 years until our committee existed.
Of course, now, as you mentioned, the governor's not running for a third term, and Senator Klobuchar, who's won races by double digits for 4 terms in the Senate, is now running for governor. How does that messaging continue to work? She was an in-state government. She's been at the federal level. How does your messaging, how does it work with a new candidate now in the race?
I don't think it changes. She has never once called out Tim Walz and his administration for all this fraud. She supported him and has done nothing to stop fraud. I mean, most of these dollars are federal Medicaid dollars. She's done nothing to try to help close these gaps in internal controls at the federal level. She didn't even show up at the hearing yesterday. So I was at the hearing testifying in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and she's not a member of the subcommittee, which is what her staff is saying, but 3 other members who are not members of the subcommittee from the full committee were there. So, and if Tim Walz would have accepted the invitation, which he didn't, I'm sure she would have come to defend him, but she wasn't there to really hear the truth about what's going on in Minnesota. Very disappointing.
In this race, realistically, though, is she a beatable candidate? Republicans haven't won a statewide race in 2 decades in Minnesota.
So I think if we put up a candidate who is credible and can win in the suburbs and can keep a strong statewide margin, yes, because Minnesotans are fed up. Wherever I go in the state, people are so frustrated, not only with the billions in tax dollars that have been stolen, but as $9 billion has been stolen from our taxpayers, their taxes were raised $11 billion. And that still left us with a $6 billion deficit. So Minnesotans are incredibly frustrated. They need someone who's going to go in there and clean house in the executive branch. It's been 20 years since Republicans have had an executive leadership position in the governor's office, and that's built up 20 years of institutional malaise.
I'll ask you about a couple of other big issues that'll be upcoming in the session and then on the campaign as well. Democrats in the House, your colleagues, are going to bring in an assault weapons ban proposal again. Would you support that in the wake of Annunciation Church?
I'm sorry, weapons ban at the Capitol?
Yes, if you were, let's say you were governor, let's say you were elected, would you support any type of assault weapons ban, or even as a legislator here in the upcoming session, will you support one?
No, there was an assault weapons ban nationally for 10 years, and what the data shows is that it didn't move the needle on violent crime. People just found a way around the definition of what an assault weapons ban was, and they bought those other guns. It didn't actually change it. The criminals will always find a way to get the gun. What we need is to enforce the law, and we need to make sure that criminals do not have access to guns. We need to strengthen the law about straw purchasing. I've worked on that for years. From my freshman year, I had a bill on that working with the ATF. We need to increase penalties for violent crimes and straw purchases, and that's how we will crack down on this.
Another issue that was really big in the 2022 campaign, of course, was abortion rights. As a governor, would you sign any bill that would restrict the rights that are currently on the books in Minnesota?
I mean, it's really hard to answer a broad hypothetical like that, so I can't imagine, there's so many nuances, but what I will say is that I think I'm pro-life. And I represent what is probably a pro-choice district. And when I talk to friends who are pro-life or pro-choice, what we find is people all across the spectrum want to reduce the number of abortions. So I would work with people on both sides of the aisle to find ways to reduce the number of abortions. And we had things that were legal under Roe in Minnesota on the books that Democrats got rid of. So I think that's the best place to start. Having parental notification, tracking the data, funding support for crisis pregnancy centers where you're supporting the woman and the baby. Those were common sense things that Minnesota used to have that the Democrats got rid of. So I think we can find ways that we want to work together to reduce the number of abortions.
But you believe the state Supreme Court decision is settled law. I know some other candidates have said that basically that this isn't something they would try to touch.
So settled law is an interesting term. I think definitely it's a strong decision, and the current makeup of the court would not support overturning it. So I don't like to think about hypotheticals, but it would be a tough road, and the current makeup of the court would never support it.
When it comes to the campaign, I know for viewers that are unfamiliar, traditionally Republicans in Minnesota have abided by the endorsement process and not necessarily the primary through voters. Would you abide by the endorsement? Would you, in other words, would you try to run in a primary if the party doesn't choose you?
Yes, I've said from the beginning, I plan to stay in the race as long as I think I'm the best person to win the general election. The endorsement matters. I come from the grassroots. I've been a precinct captain. I've done all the BPOU leadership work for years, well before I was elected. But that being said, the candidate that generally has been endorsed over the last 20 years has not been able to win in a general. And the prize is winning the general, not winning the endorsement.
So you would go on to a primary?
Yes, as long as I think I'm the best candidate to win.
Okay. Representative, thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Welcome back. This was a big week in Minnesota politics as the precinct caucuses started, where party activists and voters in the Democratic and GOP parties met across Minnesota to begin the process of endorsing and nominating candidates for the elections later this year. Here's Raya Katene with a look at the huge turnout seen from both parties.
Minnesotans across the state this week kicked off a big election year in a big way.
Certainly there's a lot of energy on both sides.
Tens of thousands of neighbors and political organizers voiced what matters most to them at precinct caucuses. It's the first step in figuring out which candidates will become the nominees for their parties ahead of the general election in November.
There was also a sense for the GOP of it's time for us to get more serious. We've not won a statewide election in 20 years. And there was a sense I felt among the folks in the precinct caucus that they wanted to win.
Although the issue of fraud hasn't made as many headlines recently, former Republican State Senate Majority Leader Amy Frederickson says it was evident last night that it's still the dominant concern for Republican voters.
I think there's a lot of question about what exactly happened with the money.
Tuesday's straw poll results show House Speaker Lisa Demuth is the GOP's preferred candidate for governor. But Frederickson says party leaders will have to work on their messaging when it comes to how the federal administration handled the crackdown on immigrants in Minnesota.
I do think that it's something that all of Minnesota is bothered by. And I think that anyone who wants to run for office or lead the state is going to have to get a strong message about what happened was wrong.
People are very nervous about what's happening on the streets of Minneapolis, right? You cannot have people gunned down and think that people are going to skip participating in the political process.
Mike Erlandson is the former chair of the Minnesota DFL. The party says a historic number of people, at least 30,000, showed up to voice their concerns, especially about ICE.
If that extra turnout that we saw this week translates into extra turnout come November elections, I think you're going to see a very, very good year for Democrats.
Erlandson says Senator Amy Klobuchar, who has little opposition from other Democrats in the race for governor, was a popular name last night. But other races, including the U.S. Senate seat and Hennepin County Attorney, Erlandson says received far less attention. Still, he anticipates voters in big numbers to carry their energy to the November elections.
People are very motivated by what we're seeing taking place on the streets of Minneapolis right now.
Speaking of ICE, that's going to be a huge topic of the next legislative session that begins later this month. And we spoke with House DFL floor leader Jamie Long, a state representative, about what some proposals may look like from their caucus and how it will be addressed at the Capitol this year. Well, floor leader, thank you for joining us here at KARE 11 today. We appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, happy to be here.
I'd like to ask you about the session that's starting soon, and you're going to be proposing a bill that would basically make it easier to sue federal agents. Can you tell us what that's going to look like?
That's right. Well, Minnesotans deserve to feel safe, and they deserve to have accountability when they've been harmed. And unfortunately, we have seen far too many instances of folks in Minnesota being injured, having their property damaged, having their doors broken in, or even most tragically being killed. And right now they're being told at the federal level that there is absolute immunity for those actions, which is not true. But the ability to seek redress at the federal level is very narrow. And so what we would be proposing is a civil remedy where folks could go to court if they had a constitutional rights violation.
So as it stands now, somebody could sue a federal or a local or state government entity, such as we saw in the murder of George Floyd, but not a federal agent under the same federal law.
That's right. For a long time, we've had these laws that apply to the state and local level, where you can sue a police officer under what's called a 1983 claim. And we've had that there's no real equivalent at the federal level. And so we would be establishing this type of a claim at the state level just for constitutional violations. So Fourth Amendment violations when someone's breaking into your house without an arrest warrant, or First Amendment violations when somebody is attacking a peaceful protester with tear gas or something else.
As I understand, Illinois recently enacted a pretty similar law to this, and the Trump administration has basically argued that Congress would need to make this change, that it's not up to state legislatures. Do you believe if Minnesota passed a law like this that it would withstand a legal challenge?
Absolutely, and we're looking at what other states have done. Our law is going to be a little different from what we've seen in Illinois or Colorado or a couple of other proposals, but there's 5 states out there that have these on the books right now. Some of them have had them on the books for many years without challenge. And our basic argument is that if you're enforcing the fundamental law of our land, which is the Constitution, then there is no supremacy issue, because we are just furthering that very basic constitutional rights that all Americans have.
Of course, you're still in a tie in the Minnesota House with Republicans. Have you spoken to them? Have they signaled any support? Would you work with them to find a measure that could have some common ground here?
I'm really hoping that this can be a bipartisan measure. When we all get elected, we swear on the same Constitution and oath of office to uphold that very basic fundamental document. And all we're saying is that Minnesotans who've had their constitutional rights violated, regardless of who that person is, regardless of which administration or agency violated those rights, that they should be able to get monetary other damages for those injuries. So that should be a nonpartisan principle.
Of course, the situation with ICE and federal immigration here has just dominated not just headlines here, but across the world. When you come back into session, what other proposals are Democrats going to be looking at?
Well, I know this will certainly be one that we are focused on, but unfortunately, we also had tragic shootings in the interim between when we were last in session, and including right outside of my district with Annunciation Church. So I'm hopeful that we can take some meaningful action on gun violence prevention. There was talk of a special session this fall that didn't get pulled together because it was clear at that time that Republicans weren't going to let these bills come up for a vote. But we'll have the means, at least in the Senate, to force a vote, and I'm hopeful in the House we can force votes on that as well. And then we really need to be talking about the top concern for Minnesotans, which is economic affordability. We know that folks are still struggling to make ends meet, and so we have a number of proposals on health care, child care, housing, groceries to try to help bring folks' costs down that we're going to be bringing forward this session.
When it comes to the response to Annunciation, of course, as you mentioned, there was no special session.
Right.
So when you come into regular session, do you have any assurances that there will be any Republican votes on the House side?
On gun violence prevention, we don't. We know that these are broadly supported by the Minnesota public. We know that there's overwhelming support for taking weapons of war off our streets and for limiting high-capacity magazines, these weapons that are able to wreak so much terror in such a short amount of time. So I'm hopeful that we can get bipartisan support for moving them. We know that the public is with us. We know that constituents are asking their legislators to support this, but we'll have to see when the votes get put up.
I know when it comes to the Senate, of course, it was questionable whether or not even the Democratic slim majority had the votes there. Do you believe it could pass the Senate today?
My understanding is that it could. I'm not in the Senate, so I can't say for certain, but I know that it can. It has the Democratic votes in the House, and we are certainly hopeful that there are some Republicans of good conscience who will be willing to come over.
I know I asked you this shortly after the Annunciation shooting, but of course, when you had the trifecta and control of state government, the assault weapons ban never made it to the finish line. It didn't advance. Why weren't you able to take that up in 23 and 24?
Well, we hadn't acted on gun violence prevention in decades at the state level. It was an area that had been stuck. And so there was some real concern about doing too much at once, and that might sort of let the whole effort fall of its own weight. And so the focus was on universal background checks and red flag laws. We passed both of those. Both of those laws are saving lives right now. But I do wish that we had gone further at that time, and I had been considering myself bringing a proposal for introducing a bill to ban assault weapons. It was an issue I've worked on for many decades personally. So this is not a new thing in our country. Unfortunately, we've had these mass shootings for many, many years. But we didn't think the political will was there, and I'm saddened that it took this action to get us to that point where we are ready to act.
Another issue I'm sure will be on the docket for both parties will be the fraud response. Do you believe the Inspector General proposal that didn't advance out of the House last year will have a chance in 2026?
Well, I know that we're going to take a hard look at that. I know there are some members on our side who are bringing proposals there. We took substantial action in 23-24 to give more authority to state agencies to be able to cut off payments, to be able to increase their agency enforcement, and that's working. We know that they are cutting off payments. We've, frankly heard a lot of pushback to some of the actions that the administration has taken that have been pretty aggressive in trying to go after fraud in a lot of these programs. Nobody in the state wants to see public dollars go to waste, particularly not the folks who have funded these programs like us, who really care about making sure that this money gets to be put to good use for people with disabilities, people with other needs that are being helped by these dollars. So we're going to be very aggressive, and I think you'll see us roll out a fraud package early this session.
Were you surprised the governor chose not to seek re-election, citing in many ways the tension around fraud?
I think that it was a tough decision whether he was going to run again. Running for a third term is a unprecedented step and a big deal, and I think he made the right call over the summer when he wanted to run, and I think probably it was the right call now that it became a bit of a distraction. But he is somebody I have tremendous respect for, and it really takes a very big person to be able to step back in a moment like this.
I know 2026 isn't a budget year, but as you look down the road, there's the looming deficit potentially of up to $3 billion at the end of the decade. What steps can the legislature take now to get that under control?
Well, we took some bipartisan action last year to try to help bend the curve on some of the increases in spending. And what we're seeing really is that folks in our state are getting older and living longer and have more expensive needs, particularly in the human services and healthcare space. And we're a very generous state when it comes to a number of these programs. We haven't in the past had caps on a lot of these programs as some other states do. And so that really has eaten up a large share of our budget. It's going to surpass K-12 education spending in the next few years. So we did start to work on trying to restrain some of those costs in the future. And I think we're going to have to keep looking at making sure those programs are meeting the needs that we have for Minnesotans for sure, because they're very important, but doing it in a way that is able to keep our budget in a situation where we're on track.
I know, especially in the House, really just for all lawmakers of all parties, it's probably going to be difficult to walk back into the Capitol later this month. What do you expect those emotions to be like without the late Speaker Emerita Melissa Hortman there?
Well, I think it's going to be really heavy for us to be back there on the first day. We've made a commitment to leave her desk vacant for the remainder of the year as an honor for Speaker Hortman. And I know that we're working on having a day of remembrance for her. She was an incredibly impactful leader in our state, and really, was an irreplaceable leader for our team in many ways. So we're going to, I think, take the time we need to remember and honor her.
Just my last question: when it comes to the relationship in the House of being still tied, you have Speaker Demuth running for governor now. What is that relationship like across party lines, given what happened in June and just all the dynamics around that?
Well, I'm hopeful that we can find some areas to work together on common ground. My proposal on constitutional remedies for Minnesotans, I think, is one where I'm hopeful we can find some common ground. Gun violence prevention, I know, is broadly popular with the public, but the political dynamics, I'm worried, are going to really potentially interfere with the ability to get things done. And we'll see if Speaker Demuth is willing to put up some of these bills for a vote. I think that she's indicated in the fall that she wouldn't when it came to gun violence prevention, and I hope that she's willing to let her members take these votes and make the decisions on their own.
Thanks for joining us again for KARE 11 On the Record. Remember, you can stream every Sunday on KARE 11 Plus at 8 a.m. and find every episode on demand.